Hey there guys, you're watching Code Lab, and in this video we're going to be taking a look at CSS Grid and looking at 3 different practical examples of when we might use CSS Grid. Now this is a follow-up video to my previous CSS Grid practical examples video, and because CSS Grid is so revolutionary and awesome, I felt it was right to show you guys even more practical examples regarding CSS Grid. So let's get started. If you guys enjoy the content, please show your support by hitting the like button and subscribing to the channel, and make sure you turn on notifications as I post weekly content so you guys never miss an update. So the first example we're going to be looking at, guys, is asymmetric design. Now the CSS Grid is the king of asymmetric design, and by definition asymmetric means the lack of symmetry, and we pretty much see this in our everyday lives, so like in tree branches or the shapes of clouds. Now the uses of asymmetrical design in web development can have a wide range. So for example, a website with a 350 pixel sidebar immediately creates an asymmetrical outline. This is because the body of the website and now the sidebar are at a different width. And this technique of asymmetric design is often employed in creating things like image galleries or even complete page layouts. So that's what we're going to be looking at in this example that you see here now. So in the body here you can see we've got a grid container with 6 grid items. Now in the browser you can see there's already some styles applied to the grid container as well as the body and the grid items. So if we head inside the style sheet, you can see there's no margin or padding, the box sizing is set to border box. The body here has 2 colors, a linear gradient, so light blue and medium purple, as well as having a height of 100 viewport heights. Now if we scroll down, you can see the grid items here have some general styles applied to them already, and inside the grid container you see I've already applied a grid here. So we've got 8 columns, each with a width of 1 fractional unit, as well as some grid gap, and I've just aligned the grid container in the middle of the browser here. Now if we also scroll down here, you can see each of the items have their own background color, and what I'm going to do now is just open this up on Inspector Tools so we can see the grid. So you can see here we've got our 8 columns. Now thinking back to our asymmetric design technique, we can utilize the columns, the grid items and the asymmetric design to create pretty cool layouts. So what I'm going to do is just grab grid item 1 here, and I'm going to say grid column, and I want this to span across let's say 5 columns. Now let's grab grid item 2, and I'm just going to use the grid column property, span this across let's say 3 columns, and you can see here now that's spanning across 3 columns. So we'll do the same for each of the rest of the items, and then let's go into grid item 3, and I'm going to say grid column, and I want this to span across let's say 3 columns as well. So you'll see now grid item 3 is spanning across 3 columns, and let's say for grid items 4 we want it to span the rest of the columns. So say grid column, and we want this to span across 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 columns. So we'll just say 5. And you'll see now that's pushed the rest of the grid items down, and grid items 4 now is spanning across 5 columns. And you can see we're already creating pretty cool layouts simply by just using the asymmetric design technique. So let's just finish off these last couple of items here. So we say for grid item 5, I want the grid column to let's span this across let's say 6 columns. So it's pushing almost to the end here. And then for grid item 6, I just want the grid column here to span across 2. And again guys, as you can see with the asymmetric design technique of the grid, we can create cool layouts for our project. Now the last thing to do here is just make this responsive. So we're just going to use a quick media query here. So at media, and we're going to say max width. So let's give it a max width of let's say 600 pixels. And then we're just going to grab the grid container or the class of grid container, and we're going to say grid template columns 1fr. So what this should do now is if we make the screen size smaller, they should stack on top of each other. So we'll get to 600 pixels, and then as you can see now they're stacking on top of each other. But the immediate issue that you can see here is that we have a bug and the layout is pretty messed up. Now what's happening is that because we've created 8 columns, the items are spanning across different columns, and the grid is trying to accommodate for this, resulting in this messed up layout. So to fix this, we need to make sure all the items are spanning the same amount of columns. So what I need to do is just go underneath the grid container here, grab the grid container again, and then we're just going to grab every item inside the grid container, and we want this to grid column span 1. And as you can see now, this fixes the bug issue, and the items now are spanning across the same width. Now the next practical example will be combining what we learned in the previous example of asymmetric technique and then creating a responsive navbar from it. So we're inside VS Code, and inside this folder here we have two files of index.html and style.css and just a really basic document here. And then I've also opened this up in live server. So what I'm going to do first is just go inside the body and create our navbar. So I'm going to use the semantic tag of nav, and I'm going to give this a class of main nav. And inside this I first want to insert a div with a class of logo, and this is just going to represent our logo. I'm just going to put text in here of logo. And then underneath this I'm just going to put our first UL, which is just going to have a class of buttons or BTNS, because we're going to have two buttons in here. So we're going to have a button for the sign up, so it's just going to say sign up in there. And let's also give this a class of BTN1, and I'm just going to duplicate this BTN2, and this is going to be for the login. So we've got log in, and then underneath this UL we're going to have our hamburger menu. Now I'm not going to create a complete hamburger menu from scratch. I'm just going to use a HTML entity, just because it will save us a lot of time. And the whole point of this video isn't about the hamburger menu. It's just to show you guys another example of CSS Grid. So what I'm going to do is just give this a class of menu, hit tab, and then the HTML entity is and EQIV semicolon, and that should give us a hamburger menu, which is really tiny that you see in the corner there. And then underneath this menu I'm just going to insert our other UL, so it's going to be for the actual nav. So it's going to have 3 list items and with an anchor tag in between this. So I'm just going to put hash there because it's not going anywhere. So we're going to have home, and then duplicate this 2 more times. Second one is going to be services, and then the third one is just going to be the about section. So that's it for the nav. What I'm going to do now is head inside the style sheet, and the first thing I want to do is just remove all the default styling for our anchor tags and list items here. So I'm just going to grab the list style property and say a value of none, and then for the anchor tags, text decoration none, and then so that just removes the default styling there, as you can see. Now the next thing I want to do is grab the main nav, and I just want a width of this to be 100%, make the height of this, let's say about 100 pixels, and then just set a background color to this too. So let's just say RGB. First value is 89, and then for the green and blue it's going to be 83. So 83, and that should be like a dark grey color that you see there. And another thing I want to do actually is just make sure the color of the anchor tags and the buttons, or the text in the buttons, is white. So I grab the anchor tags, so the not counter reset, color to white, and then grab the button classes and set color of this to also be white. Now the next thing I want to do now is go inside the main nav class again, and I just want to create a grid. So I'm going to say display grid, and then from here I just want to use the technique that we just learned in the previous example and apply it to this navbar. So we're just going to create a bunch of columns. So grid template columns, and I'm just going to say repeat, and we're going to have about, let's say 6 columns, and then have a width of 1 fractional unit. So we'll open this up now in the inspector tool, and you can see we have our 6 columns, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Now let's also actually add a bit of grid gap. So let's just say about 10 pixels. And then let's also make the color of the text white. And then let's also just align the content to the center, because right now it's aligned at the top of the grid. So we'll grab the align content. Let's just center this, so all our content now is at the center, so you can see the grid has moved to the center. So from here now, what I want to do is actually just remove the buttons and the hamburger menu, or the entity that's representing the hamburger menu. So we're going to grab the ID of BTNS, which is the buttons, and I just want to set display value to none and you see now they've disappeared. So the next one I want to do is grab the menu, and I want to set the display value of this also to be none. So that should get rid of the hamburger menu. So now we just have the 6 columns, and we have the logo and the navigation bar, or the second nav bar. Now from here, we want to use a technique we just learnt from the previous example and grab the logo, and I want this to span across 4 columns. So I'm going to grab the class of logo, and we'll just go down here and say grid column and say span 4. So you'll see now the logo is spanning across 4 columns, and then for the nav bar here, I just want it to span across 2. So we're just going to grab the nav. It's got the class of nav, so we're just going to set the grid column of this to span 2. So that should span 2 now. You won't see a difference, but this is spanning 2 columns now. And then the next thing I want to do is just make the text to align at the center. So as you can see now, the text is lining bang in the center between the 2 columns because it is spanning across 2 columns. Now what I want to do now is just grab the list items inside the nav, and I want to set them to a display of inline block. So now they'll stack up next to each other, and then what I want to do is just give them a bit of space between them. So we're going to grab some margin and say 10 pixels, and then let's just also make the font size of the text, let's make it about 20 pixels. So there's our nav right there, so it looks pretty good. So the next thing I want to do here actually is just increase the font size of the logo. So font size, this, let's say 40 pixels, and then let's also just give it a bit of padding on the left side so it's not up against the browser, and let's just say 30 pixels. So if I just get rid of the tool here, you can see there's our nav bar. So already it looks pretty good. So the next thing I want to do now is just make this all responsive. So we'll use media queries again for this. So we're just going to grab the media rule, and I'm just going to set a max width here of 768 pixels, and then let's first grab the logo, and I just want the font size of this on smaller screens to be a bit smaller, so say 30 pixels. And then I want these 3 list items here to not appear when they get to smaller screen sizes or hit that threshold of 768 pixels. So we'll grab the class of nav, and we'll just set a display to none. And what I'm going to do is just grab the browser and just make this smaller, so you can see now the 3 list items no longer display, and the logo text got a bit smaller. So just adjust that here. Now from here, I just want to bring in those buttons. So grab the class of BTNS, and I'm just going to set a display here of block to bring them back into view. So there's our buttons, and then I also want to bring in that hamburger menu. So menu, and I'm just going to set a display here to block also. And then from here, I just want to open up the inspector tools and grab the body and open up the grid. You can see the logo is still spanning across 4 columns, but I want the buttons to span across 2. So I'm going to lower the span for the logo here, so grid column, and I'm going to say span 3. So now the logo is spanning across 3, and then for the buttons, I want these to grid column, I want these to span across 2, and then by default the menu is already spanning across 1, but I just wanted to make sure, so I grab the span of 1 here. So now the logo is spanning across 3 columns, the buttons are spanning across 2, and then the hamburger menu is just spanning across 1. So the next thing I want to do here is just align the buttons here to the center of the 2 columns it's spanning. So we're going to say text align to the center here, so that should put them in the middle of the 2 columns. And then I just want to make sure that these list items don't stack on top of each other, so I'm just going to grab the BTNS LI, and I'm just going to set the display here to inline block. And then from here, I'm just going to get rid of this inspector tool here, and I'm just going to style the buttons up a little bit. So I'm going to grab the first button here, so it has a class of BTN1. I want to set the background of this to be transparent, the border of 1 pixel solid, and then let's just make it white, and then let's just make the border radius more rounded, so 30 pixels. and then let's just give it a bit of breathing room, so padding, let's say 10 pixels. And now let's also style the login button, so this has a class of btn 2, so let's give this a background of let's say light blue, a border radius of 30 pixels, so pretty similar to the first button here. And then let's also give it a padding of 10 pixels. And then for this one, the border, let's make it solid 1 pixel, and also make this light blue. Let's add a hover effect onto these buttons, and you guys don't have to do this, but I'm just doing it for this example. So for button 1 on the hover, I need to add the hover class here. Let's say hover. Want the hover here to be, let's change the background color to white, and the color of the text to black. So if I hover over the first button here, you'll see now the background color changes to white and the text becomes black. And then for the login, let's do the same thing. So btn2 hover, and let's just change the background of this to be light green. So if I hover over the second button here, you see now the background color changes to a light green. So that's it for the buttons there. The next thing I want to do is just give some more styling to the hamburger menu here, because it's really tiny, so I'm going to make it bigger. So font size, let's say 30 pixels. So that's nice and big now. Now another cool thing we can do with CSS Grid is that we can actually order these however we want. So let's just say I want the hamburger menu to be where the buttons are. We can affect that. So I'm just going to say for the menu, I want this to be order of 2. So it's second because the logo is first. And then for the buttons here, we'll just set the order to 3. And you'll see now they'll actually switch roles. And then for the menu, let's just text align this to the right, so it's pushed up against the buttons here. So again, you can see how instead of just going up to the markup and switching these around, we can just use the order property, and it's much more simpler and more effective. So the last thing I want to do now is just get rid of the buttons when we get to even smaller screen sizes. So let's say 500 pixels. So grab the media raw again, brackets, max width threshold, 500 pixels. And then we'll say for the buttons, let's set display to none, and let's see if we shrink down, they should disappear. So you see at 500 pixels they're disappearing. And as for the hamburger menu, I just want it to be more closer to the edge here. So to do that, all we need to do is just grab the menu class and just span it across 2 columns, so grid column span 2, and that should push it closer to the edge of the browser here. And as you can see now, we've created a fully responsive navigation bar with CSS Grid, as well as utilizing the asymmetric technique to help us create the nav bar. So if I grab this, currently right now it's just showing the logo as well as the hamburger menu. If we get a bit bigger, you'll see it'll include the buttons now, and then when we get even bigger, you'll see it show us the 3 list items. So again, a fully responsive navbar using CSS Grid. Now another cool aspect of CSS Grid is the ability for grid items to also be grid containers. So CSS Grid is just so game changing and so powerful, it makes coding so much easier than it used to be. Alright guys, so to help me demonstrate how nested grids work, I'm going to be creating these Avengers bio cards, which are also going to be responsive. So if we go inside the body, we have a div with a class of card container, which houses all the cards. And then inside that we have div with a class of card, which wraps around a div with a class of Avengers image, which is just going to be the image tag, so it's just going to be the image of that specific Avenger. Then underneath that, there's also going to be a div with the class of Avenger info, which just has h2 for the hero name, a paragraph tag for the powers, a h3 for the bio section, and then just a paragraph tag with some dummy text. So this is going to be the same for all of the Avengers here. So the first thing I immediately need to do here is just change the size of the images so they're all the same size. So I'm going to go inside the style sheet, grab the card container, and then grab the images, and I'm going to give them a width of, let's say, 180 pixels, and then also a height of 300 pixels. And then if we look at the images now, you can see there the size we want them to be, but a few of them are a bit stretched and kind of losing their aspect ratio. So to fix that, we're going to be using the object fit property. So object fit, and we're going to use the value of cover. And as you can see now, it's giving them a much finer cut, and it keeps their aspect ratio, so they look a lot nicer. So the next thing I want to do here is just style the cards a little bit. So I'm going to grab the class of card. I'm going to give them a background of an RGBA value, and I'm going to say for red, blue and green, I'm going to say 255, 255 and 255, and then for the opacity I'm going to say 0.2, and just get rid of all this text there. And then I also want to give them some box shadow, so let's say 0 on the X and Y and about 5 pixels blur, and then also give them an RGBA value for the color, so 0 for the red and blue and green, 0 again, and then let's say 0.1 for the opacity, and then let's also give the bit of padding too, so padding 10 pixels, just so the content has a bit more space. Now you can vaguely see the box shadow here. You will be able to see it more clearly in just a moment when I make this responsive. So that's what I'm going to do now. Grab the card container, and I'm going to set a display of grid. And the really cool thing about CSS Grid is that we can make this all responsive in just one line of code. So to do that, I'm going to grab the grid template columns, grab the repeat function, and I'm going to use the keyword of auto fit, and then also use the min max function, which basically sets a min and a maximum width for our cards. So we want the cards to be 400 pixels minimum, and then 1 FR for the maximum. And as you can see now, it's already becoming responsive. Now if you guys want a more in-depth analysis of how the keywords of auto fit, autofill, the min max function work, I do have a 5 Minute Fridays episode which goes a lot more in depth about how it can make your grid more responsive. But if I grab the browser here, you can see once I get to bigger screen sizes and I hit that minimum threshold of 400 pixels, you'll see because of the auto fit keyword here, it will actually automatically fit a new one on there. So now it's got enough space to fit 3 cards, and if I get even bigger, you'll see it will trigger that 400 pixels, and then it'll fit another card on there. And then if we get even smaller, you'll see it's got a minimum width of 400 pixels. So once that is triggered again, there's not enough space to have 3 cards. It will go to 2 cards, and then if I get even smaller, you'll see it won't have space for 2 cards. It will just stack on top of each other. So that's how we can make this all responsive in just one line of code. I'm just going to bring that back. Now I'm also just going to quickly add a bit of grid gap here of about 20 pixels. So just to give some space between the cards. Now in regards to the example of showing nested grid items, if we look at our index.html here, you can see inside of each of the cards we have the Avengers image, and we also have the Avengers info. Now by default this is stacking on top of each other, and what I want is actually the image to appear on the left and the text here, or the info, to appear on the right. Now to achieve that, we're going to need to use nested grids. So we're going to go inside the style sheet, and we're going to go inside the card here. Now this is already a grid item, but because CSS Grid is so awesome, this can also be a grid container. So to make this a grid container, we simply just go in here and say display grid, and then I want 2 columns here, so I'm going to say grid template columns of repeat, so 2 columns and then 1 FR. And as you can see in the browser now, we've created a grid within a grid, and this has resulted in the image being on the left and the text being on the right, which is what we wanted. And then what we can do from here is align the text more centrally if we like. So we'll use the align items, and we'll just say to the center. And I mean, you guys can style the text however you like from here. And as you can see here, with just 3 bits of CSS code, we've managed to make a fully responsive bio card section, as well as applying a nested grid within a grid. So that will conclude the video, guys. If you guys enjoyed the video, please hit that like button, and please consider subscribing. If you have any questions, leave them down below, and I'll see you guys next time.